Greetings and blessings, YouTube. This is John the Jansenist, and this is a video that's being done by request from another user who frequents another channel of mine, the primary political channel that I run, the Hell's Unicorn channel. And it has to do specifically with the Methodist movement, the Methodist Church. It also gets into the realm of politics a bit, particularly with Rick Perry, who is the predominant Methodist candidate for president right now. And it also gets into a little bit some of Rick Perry's specific positions and how they are rooted in Methodism, and ultimately why I am diametrically opposed not just to Rick Perry but to the entire Methodist Church. To start off with, you have to consider the roots of Methodism, and they are founded in the theology of John Wesley, who is largely credited with the founding of the Methodist movement. Now, the thing to understand first and foremost about John Wesley is that John Wesley's theology was rooted in Arminian theology, and Arminian theology is the theology that was espoused in opposition to John Calvin in the Reformed Protestant movement. Now, obviously, my standing is outside of this argument with regards to actual church establishment, though it is interrelated with this argument in terms of general doctrine. Arminian theology teaches that the prevenient grace that was procured through Christ's sacrifice on the cross is universally transmitted to all people living and who will live in the future on earth from that point in time, and that there is a free will choice to either accept or to deny the saving faith of Christ, so to speak. That's the belief that most Christians hold to, that the beginning of a path towards a life worthy of heaven begins with an act of saving faith. This is a semi-universalistic view of divine sovereign grace, and it's one that I do not concur with, and there is a lot of scripture that runs contrary to this viewpoint. Some that would argue in favor of it if it is divorced from its context and taken with a few particular verses in mind, particularly John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." Now, the thing to understand is that when the Bible says world, it can denote a couple of different things, and I've actually provided a link in the description to some theological points that were made by Blaise Pascal, where he describes these distinctions and how they apply in each particular case, as it were, which definition would tend to apply where, and this all gets into the realm of systematic theology. To put it in layman terms, my belief is that although grace is prevenient in the sense that grace proceeds from the crucifixion, and therefore there is one particular point in time from where it comes from, it is projected retroactively into the past, and it's also projected into the future. Prevenient grace for Arminians tends to only be projected into the future. And I also believe that prevenient grace is particular. And there are quotes in the Bible that I will put in the description under a particular heading that will further get into this. But basically, I hold to the viewpoint as espoused in the scripture, "No man may come to me unless the Father first draw him, and I will raise him up at the last days." This is something that's very, very clearly pointed out in the gospel. It is directly from the horse's mouth, from Jesus himself. Now, for most people in Christianity today, most people that are in the so-called Christian faith, this is seen as splitting hairs. But from the viewpoint of somebody such as myself, this is a very serious matter, because it draws into question, is God actually sovereign? Is he actually in control of his own creation? Or is he powerless in some respects from affecting outcomes, even whether it be in a very direct or in a somewhat passive fashion? And, of course, obviously there is, does it agree with the scriptures and with the traditions that flow from them, which we see in the early church fathers and throughout the age of the church? This theological distinction makes the difference in believing that someone should resort to continually preaching at someone over and over again, regardless to whether or not they show any interest in it whatsoever, and moving on to greener pastures. And most of your particularly annoying preachers that continue coming back to your door even after you've said no several times, such as Jehovah's Witness, they are very Pelagian and very Arminian in their outlook as regards to how grace goes. Those are your Arminians. Those are the people that are constantly annoying you and constantly not giving you any rest. You really have to be forceful with these people in order to get rid of them. Apparently they haven't read Titus, particularly the quote, "A heretic after the second admonition reject." And there's other quotes in addition to that get into this. But really, from the standpoint of politics, this works itself out in a very distinct and particular way. And this gets into other aspects of John Wesley's life. In addition to being an Arminian, John Wesley was a member of the Church of England. He was an ordained cleric, and he came to America to evangelize people in America. Not everybody in America was in good standing with the Church of England. There were dissenters that were Lutheran. Some were the Presbyterian Church of Scotland in England had a lot of problems back then, and a good chunk of the people living, particularly in New England at the time, were either Presbyterian or Congregationalist, and they were all dissenting with the Church of England, which was viewed as having a prelate church government, which is something a bit closer to what the Roman Catholic Church has. John Wesley, once he got to America, approached ordination of other ministers in a way that was out of step with the rules and guidelines of the Anglican Church, and he actually fell out of favor with them, and that's how you get the Methodist Church. Methodism in America is basically Anglicanism with a lack of respect for church authority. Methodists tend to be all over the place. There is a sense of unity among them, but much like with Baptist leagues, these people can be all over the place. And a lot of them get into holiness preaching, Pentecostalism, charismatic stuff. That's where you get all the tongue speaking. And in real extreme cases, you can get snake charmers. You can get all sorts of weird stuff. And I think we can all pretty well guess that the reason why you had all of these extreme statements being made at all of these particular events where Rick Perry was the headliner, it was because he was with like-minded company, and why Rick Perry himself can't seem to keep his facts straight. Because when you're in a Pentecostal or charismatic church, you're not dealing with theology in a logical fashion. You're dealing with it in a emotionalistic, spiritualistic fashion, and as such, your priorities get confuted. You will find that in most churches where a very clear sense of government and structure exists, it's usually because they have a very particular attitude about how the organization of their doctrine works. And this is pretty much where I break ties with any kind of uber spiritualistic churches. I don't consider myself to be aspiritual or not of a firmly rooted faith in the sense that one might think, to the point where I'm a hardcore rationalist that kind of borderlines on atheism. But there is definitely something to be said for the fact that there are very clear things that are written and spelled out in the Bible. They have to be taken in their proper context, and they have to be organized in a fashion so that they make sense with each other. Out of the Pentecostal charismatic movement, neo-charismatic movements, everything that's associated with Methodism, you get the whole concept of works righteousness, spiritual healing, all of this other stuff. I mean, it's all over the place. And this gets into my problem with the Methodist depiction of Jesus. And along with this comes an old Methodist saying that in some sense could be rooted back into Martin Luther, but it really, really didn't get going until, Pelagian ideas started intermingling with Protestantism. What would Jesus do is an argument that we as Christians of our own quote-unquote free will are to model our lives exactly the way Christ's life was modeled. That's what it's rooted in. That depiction of the hippie Jesus in the toga, that is perfectly in line with the argument that a good Christian bends over backwards in all cases, regardless of the context, to tarry with enemies of the faith, no matter how brutal they are. They will go out of their way to promote certain versions of social justice that are more in line with socialism than they are with the actual tenets of economics found in the Old Testament, which is much closer to modern free market practices than they are to the European concept of socialism, particularly if you look at the book of Proverbs. The Wesleyan or the Methodist Jesus is a depiction of the idea that we work ourselves into the good graces of God, so to speak. And this is a complete reversal of what I believe. I believe that we are brought into conformity with the law. That is, the law that was published in the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments, the two caveats of the Ten Commandments, the two things that actually define what the Ten Commandments are: love God with your whole heart, love your neighbor as yourself, all of that. This is done through a process of spiritual regeneration that occurs through a monergistic, a one-sided act that brings this about, and this is done wholly of God. As a person believing in the Augustinian tenet of total depravity, I don't believe that we come into the faith simply by willing to come into it from some ability that's innate with us from birth. I think that there is a very particular and specific moment of conversion where everything begins. It's not necessarily a moment that anyone catches at the time, and usually there is a gradual evolution of this new mentality that causes a person to modify their behavior and their beliefs accordingly. I don't believe that what would Jesus do is the best way to define what Christianity is. What defines Christianity is what Jesus did, which was he led a perfect life according to the laws of the Old Testament. He ministered unto a perfect church. He basically conducted a perfect ministry, perfectly conformed with the law. He was a man that was free from sin in the sense that, one, he was not born with sin, due to the advent of the hypostatic union, being at one with the pure spirit and essence of the Trinity, basically freed him from the curse that was visited upon all other men since the fall of Adam. And along with that, he provided the necessary atonement to pay back the punishment that had been continuing to flow forth from the broken covenant of works that was originally set up in the Garden of Eden and was broken through Adam's sin. And a new covenant was formed that specifically made it possible, even though we were imperfect, to have our sins forgiven, to be completely covered over, and thus we would be made worthy. Not that we would make ourselves worthy, but that we would be made worthy. It's a passive relationship on our end until that point of conversion. Then it becomes synergistic. Then it becomes a partnership. in which we work to better ourselves in the new spirit that we have been given by virtue of this conversion. Now, how does it work itself out in politics? People with Pelagian views of morality from a Christian standpoint tend to be pretty authoritarian. That might sound a little bit strange to somebody coming from the libertarian mindset, because this whole notion of free will in the Christian context sounds like it's more compatible with libertarianism than this notion of total depravity. But let me tell you a few things about Pelagianism that may make you think twice about that. Pelagianism and Arminianism. Arminianism is a form of Pelagianism. So when I say Pelagianism, what I mean specifically is any school of theological thought within Christianity that pushes the idea that people can perfect themselves or make themselves worthy of God's adoration without any kind of help. People that are of the mindset that man can be perfected and can be molded into the ideal man are generally people that believe that this will come about through an elite class of people who can accomplish a form of moral perfection and then either guide, direct, or force others into the same way of being. John Wesley himself had a doctrine of Christian perfection, which was part of his holiness movement. He believed that a person could reach a state of perfection where he was of perfect faith and thus was free from sin while still living. This runs contrary to the basic tenet of the fall, which is that by sin we are going to die. Because if we're free from sin, we are free from the curse of death, and we should live forever. And I will tell you something right now, John Wesley is very much dead, and he is not coming back. His movement lives on, and I think that's very unfortunate, but he is not. If you look at the examples of various socialistic and communistic utopians, you can see strains of Pelagian thought, but in a more paganized and secular sense. People that believe that through certain changes in economics we can bring about a society that can aspire to perfection, to better things. You can look to recent utopian movements like the so-called Zeitgeist movement and the Venus Project as further extension of these ideas. You will not find very many free market proponents within Christianity that truly hold to a consistent version of works righteousness. Now, how can a belief in universal total depravity on the part of someone like me translate into libertarian politics? Well, it's pure and simple. Everybody's depraved, and therefore nobody is to be trusted with too much power. That's basically the standpoint that I come to. I come from the standpoint that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, as Lord Atherton said. So a system of governance should be devised that checks any form of depravity, be it depravity of the individual, depravity of the elite, or depravity of the mob or the majority. So a form of republicanism is naturally implied. Now, I think that the republicanism should take on the form of a very loose-knit confederation, that the more local you get, the stronger the government gets, with the strongest and most prevalent government of all being self-governance. There should naturally be various institutions that promote good self-governance through voluntary education, both in morality, in the things that come out of morality, such as politics, economics, the arts, the sciences, all of this stuff, so that a person can be made aware of his choices and also the ramifications of those choices. And through all of this, we come to a state where we accept that the world is not perfect and we cannot make it perfect. If it becomes perfect at some point in the future, it will be because of something that comes about, which I believe will come about via the book of Revelation at some later date. I don't know when it's going to be, and I don't pretend to know when it's going to be. Another thing that you will find a lot of in Methodism is ideas that are about as out of whack as what you get from Harold Camping when it comes to end times. You'll get people dabbling in numerology, even in astrology, in order to try to figure out when the end is coming and when Christ is returning. Oh, and leave us not forget the Christian Zionist movement and their efforts to actually make the end times happen by promoting the state of Israel and promoting conflict between Israel and its neighbors. To sum all of this up, Arminianism is the Christian root from which flows the stem, the branches, and the leaves of modern-day totalitarianism. It's not the only root of it. You can find roots of it in other various figures. I would argue that Anabaptistic thinkers that are somewhat anarchistic in their outlook are actually indirectly fueling communist ideology also. I would argue that the theology of people like Michael Servetus and a couple of other people in the early Anabaptist movement were also very heavily influential on what later became the German Christian communistic movement, which paved the way to Karl Marx. And I would also argue that in certain Erastian versions of Christianity, this is Christianity that promotes Caesaropapism and the idea that the king or the monarch is the head of the church. This gets into the notion of state government. State government tends to be a little more fascistic in some respects, and more corporatistic, but it's still largely an authoritarian mindset. And that pretty well covers a good chunk of the Church of England. There's always exceptions to these things. The Church of Sweden and a lot of Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, how all of this pertains to Rick Perry is that Rick Perry believes in the notion of legislating. One of the things that I'm probably going to get into another video on my Hell's Unicorn channel is that I think the whole notion of saying you can't legislate morality is actually a rather stupid statement, because anytime you legislate a law, you're legislating a form of morality. A Pelagian thinker will argue that you can legislate forms of morality that are generally reserved to the individual or to the family, the household, and the small close-knit community. And this is brought about again through the quasi-utopian outlook that these people tend to have. So when you see Rick Perry talking about, we need to bring back school prayer, well, that's kind of an open-ended assertion. I mean, I have no problem with school prayer so long as that it's a school that I choose to send my kids to and that it's a school that agrees with me theologically. That's my stance on school prayer. Good for me, good for what I believe if I can get it. Doesn't necessarily have to be good for anybody else. Whoever else agrees with me, same thing. But when a presidential candidate talks about school prayer and enacting it nationally, or even enacting it in as large of a state as Texas, what kind of school prayer are we talking about? As I just laid out in my differences with Arminianism, I don't really think that I actually believe in the same God as these people, because they view God in a very different way, and they view the things that God has done in a very different way. So we most likely would not pray the same way. I've never prayed with a Methodist before, and I probably never will. I'm not really big on their churches, and I've known a few Methodists, and I've generally, with a few exceptions, I don't really tend to see eye to eye with them on a lot of things. So that's just the way it comes out. But overall, Perry is arguing from the standpoint that the federal government can project outward a sort of ecumenical, or universal is a word that's probably more easily understood, way of doing things in sort of a one-size-fits-all fashion. Now, the thing to understand for those of us out there that actually understand American history is that America as a whole country, even when it was just 13 smaller colonies, did not see eye to eye with each other on theological issues. They established they put a clause in the Constitution, right in the First Amendment, saying no established national church, because they already had state churches in several of the states. And so which church is it going to be? Is it going to be the Anglicans? Is it going to be the Presbyterian Church? Is it going to be the Roman Catholic Church, the way the colony of Maryland wanted? Is it going to be the Quaker religion, the way the Pennsylvanians wanted? Was it going to be Congregationalists like the ones up in Massachusetts? I mean, your guess is as good as mine when you've got that many different mindsets all in the same country. There is nothing in the Constitution of this country that permits establishing a national church. So one representative in the president that is of one peculiar faith is not really in a position to decree to everybody else in the country what we believe. He's not in a position to do it, even if he had the power to do it. There'd still be so much resistance that it wouldn't be practical. And furthermore, he's not going to decree the same things that I would decree if I was in that position, and I wouldn't be in that position because I view Christian politics through the lens of compromise if you can and secede if you must, which means that if I can't come to a agreeable position with somebody else, I don't bother with them. I don't believe in conquering other people in order to get my point across, unless it's a situation where they're coming to try and conquer me. And then it says, turn the other cheek on your own accord in the Bible. However, it doesn't say turn the other cheek while your friends and family are being wronged. And so we're very much in a position to defend our friends and our neighbors from perceived threats. And a person who wants to meld church and state together the way that Perry does, coming from the kind of theological viewpoint that he does, doesn't sit well with me. I agree with him on a lot of things. I don't think there's a problem with children praying in school, provided that the things that I said earlier about school choice are addressed and that we don't have to subsidize things that we don't agree with. And even, things like the abortion issue, I'm very much opposed to any form of violence against anybody that can't defend themselves. And I define fetuses as people also. There's the distinctions between an unborn child and a born child are merely at degrees of development, nothing more. There's nothing genetically unique about a zygote that separates it from any other stage in human life. The only thing that separates a zygote or the various stages of a fetus from a person is that you don't have to hear a fetus scream when you rip it apart. So in conclusion, that is basically my stance on Rick Perry's presidency or his presidential campaign, and also on the Methodist Church and on the Methodist Jesus. The Methodist Jesus offends me more so for what it represents, which is a view of grace and atonement that I think is diametrically opposed to what the Bible teaches. So until next time, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, God be with you all.